all seen images of extreme and unpredictable weather around the world. We're hearing more and more about hurricanes, flooding and drought, and it's always over there. Here in Ireland, we're used to varying weather. The old saying, if you don't like the weather in Ireland, wait a minute. We can experience all seasons in one day here. This has always been the case, and we're used to that. But recently, things are noticeably changing in Ireland. Weather events have become more intense, more unpredictable. In recent years, we've seen some more extreme flooding, seasons shifting, temperatures wildly changing, even severely cold winters in excess of -17 degrees Celsius. Scientists are telling us that weather here in Ireland is starting to change permanently, that seasons are shifting, and that Ireland is heating up. So are we going to see a warmer Ireland into the future? And if so, what's causing it? In the last few years, Irish weather has been interesting, to say the least. Summers so dry that we don't have much rainfall for weeks on end. We've seen major flooding in areas we've never seen before. We've even seen winters so cold that animals have been dying in the fields.
Occasional sheep is still being found in the snowdrifts, but farmer James McHenry believes his livelihood may have been dealt a deadly blow.
The situation's very, very bad here. I would just sum things up this morning and I would safely say that this is the end of my farming career.
Here in East Clare, last year weather was so bad and rainfall so high that farmers ran out of fodder.
It's silent enough for that.
Right, now, I'm here because of what happened last winter. I mean, I've heard news all over the country that there were problems. You were affected by that, were you?
Really, it was weather related. You know, the weather from mid-2012 to, you could say, mid-2013, like we got 12 months of atrocious weather.
What happened? What actually happened?
Ground conditions wet. Yes, very even from August of 2012, you know, we were kind of worried that there wasn't going to be enough to follow.
I know, and I found farmers, I mean, I've seen farmers around the country that suffered around the country, right down in Wexford, in County Meath, big farmers, really wealthy farmers too that did, so small and big. So this was, how serious was this event compared to anything else that's happened before?
Well, sure, I suppose you'd have to say when we had to import fodder from England and France and further afield, you know, it was unprecedented. It's certainly the worst I remember anyway.
So what's going on with Irish weather? Are these changes permanent, or just part of the natural variability cycle? One way to find out is by going to those who monitor, record and predict the weather. Here in Ireland, that's Met Éireann.
Well, certainly over the last few decades, there is evidence that the climate of Ireland has warmed up. We can see that in the records. People will remember that perhaps a few years ago we had a sequence of very cold winters. And I know at the time a lot of people said, where's global warming? But in fact, if you go back over many decades, you can see a trend of rising temperatures in Ireland. So you do have natural variability where you will get years that are perhaps a bit colder than usual. But the trend is definitely upwards. We are seeing a warmer climate in Ireland.
So is this going to be a big change for Ireland on a permanent basis? And if so, what will the impact be?
There will be changes in the precipitation patterns around the country, which may have negative impacts on areas such as agriculture. But nevertheless, when you look at the global context, and Ireland can't isolate itself from what's happening globally, I think overall the effects are going to be very negative. And certainly Ireland, no matter what it does, I don't think it can isolate itself from the bigger global picture. Well, there will be perhaps very substantial changes in the climate with very negative connotations for economy.
What Ray is saying is very serious for Ireland, and this explains the erratic changes in weather we've seen in recent times. But what can we expect for the future? In Glanmire, County Cork, in June 2012, this housing estate, like many others, was hit by a massive flash flood. Tons of water came pouring into the estate and came up above the windowsills.
Jim, tell us about this flood. When did it happen and what happened on that night?
It was absolutely frightening and devastating for all of us. As every house in the whole estate, 49 houses were flooded. And it happened, my wife woke at about 4 a.m. in the morning because there was rain hopping off the roof. And when she looked out the front window, she saw a flood of water, a river. And looked out the back window, another river.
And for you, what was it like? How high did the water come, for example?
It came to roughly about there, but and the repair work then started because everything a foot above had to be hacked.
Of course.
And everything below that went out.
Was this a once-off event?
Now, I'm living here about 27 years, and we could never foresee it ever happening, but due to a combination of events, it just happened on that particular date, you know. And you probably realise that, you know, that these natural disasters seem to be occurring more frequently, and they're more violent, and they're more serious than they ever were before.
How much damage, roughly, per each house?
I suppose the ballpark figure would be about 80,000 to 100,000 euros per house.
So are you left with no house insurance?
I have house insurance, but not for flood or storm damage or any insurance cover really arising from water, because of that. If this happens again, I'm cleaned out.
It's not just here in Glanmire this is happening. This type of flooding is occurring in over 300 other areas around Ireland, and there are currently over 50,000 households in Ireland who can no longer get any type of flood insurance, leaving many exposed to the possibility of total financial ruin. Climate change is already having major impacts on all forms of insurance. In fact, the largest global reinsurance company, Munich RE, states that the cost of damage from climate change-related natural disasters have increased by a shocking 350% over the last 30 years. I've been following the climate change story for over 20 years. And what's new for me is, rather than predicting what might happen in the future, I'm investigating what is happening today. In order to get an accurate idea of what's in store for Ireland, we need to look at the global picture. I've come to the Tyndall Centre in Manchester University to meet Professor Kevin Anderson. He's a leading voice and expert in climate science for over 20 years. And when not researching and lecturing on climate change, he's advising the world's governments on its causes and the best ways to stop it.
The climate is undoubtedly changing, but the climate has always changed, so there's nothing particularly new about this. What is interesting to us, and actually disturbing, is that the rate of change. So the climate is changing as it has always done, but it's going faster. The rates of change are different to how it's been in the past. And we are as confident as we are with any other area of science that this is due significantly to the emissions that we, as human beings, we put into the atmosphere, principally from burning fossil fuels, but also from the production of our food.
What sort of changes have occurred so far, globally?
Well, the changes we've seen so far are some adjustments to weather patterns. And you certainly can talk to some of the people in the poor parts of the world, they're starting to see some changes that are different to the ones that they have experienced over the past few hundred years. But we know the emissions are going up very rapidly indeed. And that what we're putting into the atmosphere locks us into climate change into the future. So what we do today affects the climate for the next 100 or 200 years. And that's our real concern, that we're putting more carbon dioxide from burning more fossil fuels every single day into the atmosphere. So every day we're locking the future into higher levels of climate change.
Over the last few years, we're hearing so many conflicting views and misleading information on climate change that has become a confusing issue for many. So what exactly is climate change? It's the balance of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere that differentiates us from other planets. It's a thin, fragile blanket that traps heat close to the Earth's surface and regulates the global temperature and climate. Critical to this atmosphere are greenhouse gas concentrations that stop some solar heat from radiating back out to space. CO2 is one of these gases. In tiny quantities, it traps the right amount of heat to keep our global average surface temperature in balance. The problem is we've already pumped well over 300 billion tons of CO2 into our fragile atmosphere. Most of this is in the last 50 years. The CO2 we put into the atmosphere will continue to do damage for hundreds of years. It stays up there and keeps accumulating. As a result, the planet will continue to heat up. The biosphere balance is so delicate that an average global heat increase of only 2 degrees Celsius will have devastating effects on all life forms. Ice cap melt will accelerate, sea levels will rise, and the hotter parts of the world will become intolerable for human life or food production. Up till now, it's mainly been climate scientists and environmentalists who've been warning us about climate change. However, more conservative organizations are now beginning to speak out.
I was a part of a study group made up of 11 military officers asked to look at the consequences of global climate change. And frankly, I came to the study group as a skeptic because I was seeing conflicting information, a huge political debate, and frankly, what we discovered was that the trends were not good.
The US Army now consider climate change to be the single largest threat to US national security, far bigger even than terrorism. The world's governments concur that climate change is a real and significant threat. Every 5 to 6 years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change published their assessment report on the current science. This is the largest international collaboration of scientists in history. More than 2,000 scientists from 150 countries agree on its content and sign off on this report before it's published. The most recent IPCC assessment report delivered their strongest warning ever that climate change is accelerating faster than ever predicted. It is man-made, and we have to act immediately to avoid catastrophic consequences.
So we're emitting carbon dioxide at a faster rate than we thought we would ever do. And there's no sign at the moment that's going to come down. So if we carry on along that pathway, and at the moment there's no suggestion that will change, then we're talking about temperatures that could be as high as 4, 5 or 6 degrees C higher. Now that doesn't sound too much if you sit in Manchester or somewhere in Ireland, you think 4, 5, 6 degrees might sound quite pleasant. But this is a global average, and our real concern is that actually the regional changes in that are enormous. So that's the sorts of changes we're seeing. And if you think of Central Europe, so the heat wave in 2003 that killed 20 to 30,000 people, you'd have 8 degrees centigrade on top of that if we carry on going as we are. So these temperatures in themselves don't sound that great, but the implications regionally are enormous.
Now at a global average 0.85 degrees Celsius warming, we're already seeing extreme weather events, as Kevin explains, and these are clearly accelerating. This is Hurricane Sandy hitting New York. It created over $60 billion of damage and blacked out New York City, displacing thousands of people. Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans displaced millions, cost over $100 billion in damage, and claimed the lives of over 1,800 people. Last November in the Philippines, a Category 5 typhoon, Haiyan, claimed 5,000 lives, leading to their government representative making this very emotional speech at the United Nations Climate Change Conference.
In solidarity with my countrymen who are struggling to find food back home, and with my brother who has not had food for the last 3 days, I will now commence a voluntary fasting for the climate until we see real ambition on climate action in accordance with the principles we have so upheld. We can fix this. We can stop this madness.
Scenes like this are becoming increasingly more common. This forest fire could be Australia or California, but in fact it is here in Ireland. These fires raged across Donegal in 2011. In 2013, there have been over 1,000 forest fires across Ireland. In fact, we're now for the first time on the UN Forest Fire High Risk list.
Many of us would suggest that what we're seeing is a breakdown of the ecosystems around the planet already. So the big ones that people imagine, sort of emblematic ones like the Amazon and the coral reefs and so forth. Now most of these will be either destroyed or very significantly denuded from the condition they're in today. At the same time, you'll see massive changes in crops and food production. So some of the estimates coming out of one of the big modelling centres in the UK show a 40% reduction in some of the staple crops in the southern hemisphere. A 40% reduction. At the same time, the population in those parts of the world will be going up very significantly indeed. So many of us who work on climate change think that 4 degrees C is a world that we have to avoid at all costs. We will very unlikely be able to adapt to it. It will have massive ecosystem impacts, and it could be that it triggers ongoing impacts beyond that. So whatever we do, we have to avoid 4 degrees C at all costs.
But how mainstream is this 4 degrees Celsius warning? Is it only the scientists that are warning us about this?
If you think of the last century, maybe they had the Second World War, the First World War. I think climate change is all of those and then some. Well, the President of the World Bank summarised that exact position in a paper that they produced last year. And he said that a 4 degree centigrade world is, quote, a doomsday scenario, unquote. We're talking hundreds of millions of people displaced, wide-scale economic collapse, the disintegration of globalised trade, and effectively every man for himself. So how does that affect Ireland? We're an open, small, highly globalised economy, and it's the most serious national and international crisis probably that the world has ever seen.
But how sure are we of the facts? How strong and solid is the science today?
In science, we've never had any other domain within science that has been scrutinised as heavily as has climate change. So this is probably one of the most robust and scrutinised forms of science that we've ever had.
Seeing as the threat from climate change is so present and looming, why don't we know more about it? And why are so many citizens so confused and unsure? Not only about the future effects of climate change, but of its very existence.
Well, the fossil fuel industry worldwide controls assets that are running into trillions of dollars. It's one of the world's largest, most powerful and best organised industries. And they have a strong vested interest in the status quo. And they're fighting tooth and nail, using the media, using politics, and using their influence throughout society to make sure that we don't understand the science.
There's an industry of people trying to misinform the public, to guide the policymakers away from making the changes that are necessary, to effectively either deny or deliberately confuse the science around climate change.
If I can give you an example, 40 years ago, the tobacco industry were presented with compelling medical evidence, and they chose, instead of accepting it and accepting regulation, they chose to engage in wide-scale misinformation. This became known as the tobacco strategy.
What cigarette do you smoke, Doctor?
It delayed effective regulation of the tobacco industry for 40 years.
Yes, according to this repeated nationwide survey, more doctors smoke Camel than any other cigarette.
If you take the tobacco strategy and what's happening now with climate science is, we're no longer dealing in billions, we're now dealing in trillions.
As our climate heats up by 4 to 6 degrees Celsius in this century, as the science and climate models project, then we in Ireland are certain of experiencing the type of extreme weather we're now seeing internationally. Professor Colin O'Dowd is one of Ireland's leading climate science experts. In fact, he was one of the lead authors of the IPCC AR5 report.
If we look at the temperature trend over 50, 100 years, it's obvious, it's increasing. The evidence is staggering that we've had a global temperature increase. And the rate of increase has been amplified or accelerated over the last 3 decades. So the physics is simple. When you put in more CO2 into the atmosphere, it traps more outgoing radiation. It's like a duvet over the planet. It keeps you warm.
So as climate change progresses, what types of events should we be planning for in Ireland? Dr. Conor Murphy has already been studying how Ireland specifically will be affected by climate change and what is likely to happen here.
So when you look into the future, for this century, what can we expect in Ireland from climate change?
For me, the big issue for Ireland is rainfall in the future. And we've seen the impacts that can have recently over the last number of years. And many of our water managers, for example, have termed this phrase monster rain to describe what they're seeing in terms of the likes of Dublin City. So we would expect those flood events to become more serious in the future, becoming more frequent and of greater magnitude. When we think about flooding, we can think of different types of flooding, and climate change has serious implications for all types of flooding. We're standing here in Clontarf, beside flood wall, and an area that's highly exposed to extreme events. And our projections globally are that the risk of extreme events and very damaging flooding in areas like this that are highly exposed to the elements in this case are particularly problematic for the future. So climate change is something we will have to deal with.
As Ireland heats up with increased rainfall and sea level rise, how real is the threat of major flooding in Ireland?
Well, the tide is still coming in here in Clontarf, but the sea level now is less than 1 metre below the ground level here. You can imagine later in the century when the sea level could likely be 1 metre higher than it is now. On top of that, a 2 metre surge, storm surge, that could bring the sea level to this. That's what we could see right around the coast in Ireland within this century.
With all the scientific information that's available to us on climate change, why are we still struggling to understand it?
It's tragic that something, as you say, that is so scientifically understood has been so poorly communicated to the general public. I mean, climate change is such a challenging, such a difficult, such an emotionally wrenching issue. It makes people feel anxious, it makes people feel concerned. Now, anxiety and concern are actually manifesting themselves as denial, and we're seeing this all over the place. That in turn, I think, has led to our media and our political classes treating this as something, a can that can be kicked down the road, and we're unable to distinguish apparently between science hoax and science fact. And effectively, climate change is an environmental cancer. It's that serious, and like any cancer, left untreated, it will eventually kill us.
The EU is the only major political body in the world who are actively tackling and setting up goals to solve the climate change problem. They have set strict carbon emission reduction targets that each EU country must meet by 2020 and 2050. So how is Ireland shaping up?
We are a small country, but per head of population we have quite a high number of emissions per capita, one of the highest in the EU. And no, we're not on track to meet our targets. Even under the best case scenario, we're seen to exceed our annual limits in 2015, 2016, and we're going to have to start to get serious about putting in place policy measures to put us on the right track to 2020. Agriculture and transport are the two key sectors, so if we're going to see reductions and move our emissions on the right pathway to meeting 2020 targets, we're going to have to see those reductions in transport and agriculture. So we have a role to play, and it is important that we acknowledge that and we actually play our part in reducing emissions nationally and globally.
So what can be done to minimise and mitigate climate change, and how can we afford it?
There are many opportunities. Countries like Sweden and Denmark have reduced their emissions. They're very prosperous, vibrant economies in particularly Sweden and Denmark that we can actually learn from. We need strong government policy, and we need absolute certainty in government policy. So that certainty is very important.
For the world to stay below a dangerous warming of +2 degrees Celsius in this century, we must reduce emissions by at least 20% by 2020 and 80 to 95% by 2050. Despite Ireland signing up to these EU targets, our greenhouse gas emissions are growing, and we still have no effective government strategy to enable us to meet these targets.
Once is once too many to have ever gone through something that we went through. It's our problem today, it's everyone's problem tomorrow.
has warned that the current spell of stormy weather doesn't yet appear to have come to an end. Our science and technology correspondent, Will Goodbody, has been looking at where the weather systems have originated and their possible causes.
8 weeks, 8 storms and one big mess. The ongoing spell of storms and flooding has caused destruction and disruption and created misery for many. So where's this sustained period of weird weather coming from? Central to it all is the jet stream, a ribbon of very fast wind caused by the meeting of cold polar air and warm tropical air. It flows between 9 and 16 kilometres above the Earth's surface, moving weather systems around the globe. During summer, the stream tends to lie above Ireland, steering milder, drier air over the country. But during winter, it lies below us, meaning the air it brings in is predominantly cold and wet. In recent weeks, the contrast between the warm and cold air masses has been abnormally severe, particularly along the northeast coast of the United States. This has generated areas of very low pressure, which have been steered towards us by the jet stream, which unusually has been sitting over or very close to Ireland.
hello there. Gerald, is it?
That's me.
How are you doing? Terry Lawton is my name. I'm calling you here from Wexford, Gerald.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, I have an inquiry. I'm wondering, do you know, are Met Éireann planning anyway soon on talking about the ongoing weather modification programs going on in Ireland?
There are no weather modifications going on in Ireland that I know about.
None that you know about. Okay. Well, I'm looking at just some recent statements from the World Meteorological Organization, and well, back in 2007, they stated that in recent years there has been a decline in the support for weather modification research and a tendency to move directly into operational projects. They said that now back in 2007, and only late last year they stated as well at the United Nations General Assembly that that if weather modification programs globally were to cease, that the weather ramifications could be catastrophic. So
they said that, but there are weather modification programs undertaken in some countries.
Yeah.
Mainly Eastern Europe and kind of beyond. But they're not undertaken by and large in Western European countries that I know of.
Okay. Do you know about? Are you talking about like just regional programs then?
The weather modification is very much a local and regional activity.
Yeah. Do you know, Jerry, about any of the ones going on around Europe? Would you know anything more about them, or whereabouts they're going on?
In the Balkans and some of those countries, but they're very local. You know, they're about stopping hail falling on or trying to at least on vineyards and things like that. They're very, very local.
Yes, yes.
We shall propose further cooperative efforts between all the nations in weather prediction and eventually in weather control.